Everyone in the city knew the name Alexander Grant, but almost no one had ever seen his face up close. He was the mysterious billionaire who owned half the skyscrapers downtown, a man who could make or break fortunes with a single phone call. Yet on a rainy Friday night, Alexander stood in a cramped pizza shop kitchen, wearing a cheap red cap and a worn delivery jacket. Grease stains dotted his borrowed uniform, and an insulated bag hung from his shoulder like any other driver. The smell of melted cheese and tomato sauce filled the air as teenage employees rushed around him, shouting orders. None of them realized the new guy beside them could buy the entire block with pocket change. Alexander wasn't there for publicity or fun. He was there for a reason that cut far deeper than money. Somewhere across the city, an arrogant customer was about to learn that lesson the hard way. And by the time they discovered who he really was, it would be far too late to undo what they'd done. The plan had started a week earlier, after Alexander watched a viral video that made his blood boil. A wealthy restaurant owner was caught on camera screaming at a young delivery driver for being beneath him. The owner, Victor Lang, just happened to be one of Alexander's loudest critics in the business world. Victor bragged constantly that he earned everything alone and owed no one respect, especially not low-level workers. Watching the clip, Alexander noticed the fear in the driver's eyes, the way the kid apologized even though he'd done nothing wrong. That image lodged itself in Alexander's mind and refused to leave. For years, he had heard rumors about Victor abusing staff, cheating suppliers, and humiliating anyone he considered less important. Alexander decided he had finally seen enough. If Victor believed delivery drivers were worthless, then a delivery driver would be the perfect person to expose him. And so, the billionaire drew up a plan that began with a disguise and a pizza box. The first challenge was blending in, something Alexander had never needed to do before. He traded his tailored suits for faded jeans, scuffed sneakers, and an old hoodie that smelled faintly of garlic. His assistant Daniel nearly choked laughing when he saw the transformation, but Alexander was deadly serious. At Tony's Fire Pizza, a small but popular shop near Victor's restaurant, Alexander applied for a job under the name Alex Gray. The owner, Tony, barely glanced at his fake resume before shrugging. "You can drive? You got a car? You're hired?" Tony said, tossing him a cap and pointing toward the ovens. Within an hour, Alexander was loading boxes, learning the routes and listening carefully to the way customers treated the staff. Some were friendly, some indifferent, and a few were downright cruel. Each interaction reminded him how invisible these workers were to people like Victor. Tonight, that invisibility would become Alexander's greatest weapon. Victor's restaurant was a sleek, modern Italian place called Lang Prime, all glass, chrome, and overpriced plates. Its clientele consisted of social climbers, wannabe influencers, and business people desperate to impress clients. Victor loved to sit at the center table, barking orders, shaking hands, and enjoying the spotlight. He also had a nasty habit of ordering from smaller places just to test their service, then berating them publicly if anything went slightly wrong. Alexander knew this because he had quietly monitored Victor's behavior for months, collecting complaints from former employees and suppliers. But nothing carried the raw power of seeing the arrogance for himself. That night, as the rain drummed against the windshield of his modest car, Alexander looked at the delivery ticket in his hand. The address printed there was unmistakable: Lang Prime. A slow, cold smile crept onto his face. The stage was set. The arrogant customer had no idea who was about to ring his door. Inside Lang Prime, Victor was in rare form. He sat at his reserved corner table with 3 guests, a smug hedge fund manager, a fashion influencer glued to her phone, and a nervous junior partner trying to impress everyone. Crystal glasses clinked, fake laughs echoed, and Victor held court like a king among servants. "You know what's wrong with this city?" he declared loudly, making sure nearby tables could hear. Too many people who think they deserve respect just for showing up. Delivery drivers, cashiers, janitors, replaceable, every one of them. The junior partner forced a laugh he clearly didn't mean. The influencer barely looked up, only murmuring, "Totally," as she checked her follower count. Victor smirked, raising his wine glass like a toast to his own cruelty. "You'll see what I mean when the pizza gets here," he added, eyes glinting with the promise of entertainment. He had ordered from Tony's specifically because he wanted an easy target. What he didn't know was that tonight his target came prepared. Back at Tony's, the staff loaded a large pepperoni pizza and garlic knots into the delivery bag for order number 47. "Customers a nightmare," one of the cooks muttered, sliding the box across the counter. "Always complaining, never tipping. Good luck, new guy." Alexander simply nodded, slipping the receipt into his pocket. The rain had intensified, turning the streets into glossy rivers that reflected neon signs and headlights. As he drove, he rehearsed his role, not as a billionaire, but as a tired, underpaid worker just trying to get through the night. He practiced keeping his shoulders slightly hunched, his voice polite but hesitant, his eyes lowered just enough to seem submissive. He wanted Victor to underestimate him completely. Every second of the drive, Alexander reminded himself of the young man in the viral video, shaking under a storm of insults. "This isn't about revenge," Alexander told himself quietly. "This is about truth." But even he knew that tonight, truth would feel a lot like justice. When Alexander arrived, Lang Prime's valet barely glanced at the old car he parked around the corner. Delivery drivers weren't allowed to use the main entrance, so he headed around to the service door, carrying the insulated bag like countless others before him. The host at the back rolled his eyes when he saw the logo on the box. "Another one?" he muttered. "Boss is in a mood. Good luck." Alexander just gave a small, awkward smile, staying in character. A waitress pointed toward Victor's table, her expression sympathetic, as if warning him away from a dangerous animal. The music in the restaurant was smooth and expensive sounding, but underneath it was a tension that clung to Victor like cologne. Alexander could feel eyes on him as he crossed the room, the eyes of people who saw not a man, but a uniform. He stopped at Victor's table, the pizza bag resting heavily against his arm. "Delivery for Mr. Lang," he said gently. The performance was about to begin. Victor looked him up and down with slow, deliberate disdain, not even glancing at the food. "You're late," he snapped, though the timestamp on the receipt proved otherwise. "Do you know how much my time is worth?" Alexander kept his expression neutral, resisting the urge to roll his eyes. "I apologize, sir. It's been raining and traffic is—" "Excuses," Victor cut in sharply, waving a dismissive hand. His guests chuckled nervously, eager to stay on his good side. "Open the box. Let's see if you at least managed not to ruin that." Alexander set the box on the table and flipped it open, revealing a perfectly baked pizza still steaming. Victor leaned in, examining it as if searching for flaws. "Crust is uneven on one side," he announced smugly. "Unacceptable." The influencer lifted her phone, already recording, sensing drama. The junior partner stared at his plate, wishing to disappear. Alexander said nothing yet, but inside, a clock had started ticking. Victor wasn't done. He picked up a slice, held it up, and let the cheese stretch dramatically downward. "Look at this," he exclaimed, loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. "Cold, soggy, pathetic, just like the people they hire." He tossed the slice back into the box, splattering a bit of sauce onto Alexander's jacket. The hedge fund manager snorted with laughter. "You should be grateful I even let your kind into my restaurant," Victor continued, his voice dripping contempt. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Around them, other diners shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. They had seen this performance before. Alexander looked down at the sauce on his sleeve, then back up at Victor, eyes calm but sharper now. "I'm just the delivery driver, sir," he replied softly. "I'm here to do my job." "And you failed at it," Victor sneered. "No tip. In fact, I should call your boss and have you fired." That was the moment Alexander decided Victor wasn't just arrogant, he was dangerous. Silence settled over the table for a brief, loaded second, the only sound the low hum of music and clinking glasses in the distance. Alexander could feel every gaze in the room pressing into his back, waiting to see if he would crack. Instead, he straightened his spine just a fraction, enough to reclaim his dignity without breaking character. "If you'd like to call my boss, sir, I can give you his number," he said, voice steady. "In fact, he'd probably love to hear your feedback." Victor smirked, mistaking composure for weakness. "Oh, I will," he replied, snatching the receipt from Alexander's hand. "People like you should remember your place. You serve, I judge." He pulled out his phone and snapped a photo of Alexander, the pizza box, and the so-called ruined order. "This will be all over my social media in an hour," Victor bragged. Alexander watched him, memorizing every arrogant word. What Victor didn't know was that the boss he planned to destroy was already standing right in front of him. And when the truth finally came out, that photo would be the evidence that ended more than just a dinner. Back at Tony's pizza shop, the phones were already lighting up when Alexander returned from the delivery. Tony stood behind the counter, face flushed with stress, a cordless phone pressed to his ear. "Sir, I understand, but our driver followed the exact delivery time window," he said, struggling to stay calm. Alexander quietly set the empty bag down and stepped aside, listening. On speaker, Victor's voice blared through the tiny store, dripping with indignation. "Your idiot driver embarrassed me in front of important guests," he barked. "The pizza was disgusting, he was late, and he had an attitude." Two teenage workers exchanged worried glances, knowing what usually came next. Tony's shoulders sagged as Victor threatened to leave scathing reviews, call the health department, and ruin the shop's reputation. Alexander clenched his jaw, feeling anger rise, not for himself, but for this small business caught in the crossfire of Victor's ego. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Lang," Tony said quietly. "We'll refund your order and send you a new one free of charge." Victor hung up without saying thank you. The store went silent as Tony slowly placed the phone back in its cradle. A delivery girl named Mia spoke first, voice shaking. "Was that him again?" Tony nodded, rubbing his temples. "Same guy, same threats. Every month it's something." He turned to Alexander, eyes apologetic but firm. "Alex, I don't know what happened there, but this guy is powerful. I can't afford to lose the shop." Alexander nodded, fully understanding the fear in Tony's eyes. "So, what are you saying?" he asked carefully. Tony sighed. "I think it's best if we let you go. He said your face will be all over his accounts by morning. If he connects you to us, we're done." The words hit harder than Alexander expected, even though he knew this wasn't his real job. Being fired over a lie still stung. "I understand," Alexander replied quietly. "I'll grab my things." Then as he walked to the back room, Mia whispered, "I'm sorry, you didn't do anything wrong." That was the problem, Alexander thought. In Victor's world, wrong simply meant unwilling to be humiliated. Alone in the small staff room, Alexander looked at himself in the cracked mirror above the sink. The cheap cap, the grease-smudged jacket, the defeated posture. It was a version of himself he'd never seen before. For years, people had bent over backward to please him. Tonight, one arrogant man had wielded that same power like a weapon. Alexander slowly removed the cap, running a hand through his graying hair as he dropped the act. This was exactly why he had come down from his glass tower, to feel in his own bones the weight of disrespect that millions carried every day. Being fired from a job he didn't need shouldn't matter, but it did. It mattered because Tony needed that shop. Mia needed her paycheck. The nameless kid in the viral video needed someone with actual power to do more than just feel bad. Alexander reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling to a contact labeled simply, "Legal." The test was over. The real operation was about to begin. Outside, rain still hammered the sidewalks as Alexander sat in his car, the delivery bag on the passenger seat like a silent witness. His lawyer, Rebecca Hale, answered on the second ring. "Alexander, everything go according to plan?" she asked, voice crisp and composed. "Better or worse than expected," he replied. He described Victor's behavior in detail, the insults, the threats, the smear campaign he'd promised to launch. "We have witnesses at the restaurant, employees at the shop, and his call likely recorded on Tony's system," Rebecca said thoughtfully. "Are you ready to move?" Alexander stared through the fogged windshield at the glowing sign of Tony's Fire Pizza. "I am," he said. "But this isn't just about me or Tony. I want everything Victor's been doing to his workers and partners dragged into the light." Rebecca smiled on the other end. "Then we'll start with what every bully hates most, paperwork and exposure." She promised to prepare the necessary steps by morning. Alexander ended the call, knowing one thing for certain. Victor Lang had just picked a fight with the one delivery driver he should never have underestimated. The next day, Victor woke up to the familiar buzz of notifications on his phone. He grinned as he scrolled through the comments under the video he'd uploaded late the night before. The clip showed Alexander at his table, the pizza box open, Victor narrating arrogantly about low standards and unprofessional workers. His followers flooded the comments with laughing emojis and insults aimed at the pathetic delivery guy. Victor relished every second, feeling powerful, respected, untouchable. He didn't notice that a few comments were different, subtle questions about why he enjoyed humiliating people. He brushed those aside as jealous nobodies. After all, he thought, this is how winners behave. By noon, he had gained 20,000 new followers and a sponsorship offer from a luxury watch brand. He strutted into Lang Prime that afternoon, certain the world agreed with him. He had no idea that outside his carefully curated bubble, something much bigger was already in motion. At a sleek law office across town, Rebecca slid a stack of printed documents across a conference table to Alexander. "This is everything you asked for," she said. "Background checks, supplier complaints, employee testimonies, even health inspection reports Victor paid to bury." Alexander scanned the pages, his eyes darkening with each line. Unpaid overtime, verbal abuse, threats to blacklist former staff if they spoke out. Contract terms changed at the last minute to squeeze small vendors dry. "He didn't just step on people," Alexander murmured. "He built his entire success on their backs, then kicked them when they fell." Rebecca nodded. "Legally, we can't destroy him for being rude, but we can expose every unethical practice he's tried to hide." She slid one more folder across the table. "And we can buy him out where it hurts the most." Inside were acquisition plans that would place Lang Prime and several of Victor's struggling properties under Alexander's control, if Victor made one crucial mistake. "What mistake?" Alexander asked, closing the folder slowly. Rebecca tapped her tablet, bringing up a paused video on the screen, Victor's viral clip from the night before. "He already made it," she said simply. "Defamation, harassment, targeted damage to a small business. Social media posts might feel like air to most people, but when you weaponize them against a specific company and a specific employee, they became evidence. We'll start by contacting Tony and offering him what he deserves: protection, expansion, and a chance to never fear that man again," Rebecca continued. "In exchange, he allows us to use the recording of last night's call, plus any previous complaints." Alexander nodded slowly, a plan crystallizing. "And Victor?" Rebecca smiled thinly. "We give him a chance to apologize, compensate and reform, or we let the truth destroy his empire for him." For the first time since putting on the delivery jacket, Alexander felt the weight of his old power settle back on his shoulders. But this time, it felt justified. Tony nearly dropped the phone when he heard who wanted to speak with him. You're kidding," he stammered, pacing across the cramped office behind the pizza ovens. On the other end, Alexander's voice was calm and familiar, but this time he used his real name. "No, Tony, I'm not kidding. I'm Alexander Grant." There was a stunned silence, broken only by the roar of the oven timer and the distant chatter of customers. "The Billionaire," Tony finally managed. "But you were here, in my kitchen, wearing a bad hat and a worse jacket," Alexander finished with a faint chuckle. "Yeah, that was me." He quickly explained his undercover visit and his reason for targeting Victor. Tony's initial shock turned to anger as he remembered the call and the threat to his livelihood. "I don't care how rich he is," Tony growled. "No one gets to treat my people like trash." When Alexander offered legal protection, compensation, and a partnership to expand Tony's Fire Pizza into a small regional chain, Tony had only one question. "What do you need from me?" he asked. Alexander's answer was simple: the truth, all of it. Over the next 48 hours, Rebecca's team collected statements from Tony's employees, former Lang Prime workers, and even a few vendors who had nothing left to lose. Stories poured in, shouted insults over minor mistakes, withheld paychecks as punishment, and threats to ruin careers if anyone spoke up. Each account painted the same picture: a man who thought power gave him the right to crush anyone below him. Alexander listened to every story, his anger simmering not as wild rage, but as cold resolve. "We're not just going to punish Victor," he said quietly during a late-night strategy meeting. "We're going to make sure no one like him can operate this way without consequences again." Meanwhile, Victor continued his usual routine, blissfully unaware. He posted more videos mocking poor service, complained loudly to staff, and bragged about putting small businesses in their place. He didn't know that this time the small business had a silent giant standing behind it. The invitation arrived at Lang Prime 2 days later, embossed in silver, addressed directly to Victor. It came from the Grant Hospitality Group, a name Victor recognized immediately as one of the most powerful investment entities in the city. His eyes lit up as he read the message. Alexander Grant himself was inviting Victor to a private dinner to discuss a potential strategic partnership. Victor practically floated across the restaurant, waving the envelope in front of his staff. "This is it," he announced. "This is the level I belong at. Billionaires don't waste time on delivery boys." His employees exchanged wary glances, but kept their thoughts to themselves. Victor imagined mergers, expansions, and more influence than ever before. He had no idea that the man he'd humiliated was the same man now holding that embossed card. And when he finally sat across the table from Alexander without the disguise, the truth would hit him with the force of every insult he'd ever thrown. By then, as the invitation promised, it would be far too late to undo the damage. The private dinner was set at one of Alexander's lesser-known properties, a quiet rooftop restaurant with a panoramic view of the city lights. Victor arrived early, dressed in his most expensive suit, rehearsing confident lines in his head. He imagined clinking glasses with Alexander, trading stories of power and influence as equals. The host led him to a secluded table by the window, where a single place setting waited. "Mr. Grant will join you shortly," the host said, bowing slightly before leaving. Victor checked his reflection in the glass, smoothing his hair, practicing his charming smile. He didn't notice the discreet cameras positioned around the room, or the way staff glanced at him with thinly veiled distaste. To him, this was just another step up the ladder. To everyone else, it was the prelude to a fall. 10 minutes later, footsteps approached from behind Victor's chair. He rose quickly, turning with his hand already extended. The man walking toward him was familiar from magazines and headlines. Alexander Grant, calm, composed, and impeccably dressed. For a split second, Victor felt intimidated by his presence, but he masked it with a broad grin. "Mr. Grant, it's an honor," he said, gripping Alexander's hand a bit too tightly. Alexander smiled politely, his eyes cool and unreadable. "Victor, thank you for accepting the invitation," he replied. They took their seats as a server poured water into crystal glasses. Victor launched into small talk, bragging about Lang Prime's elite clientele and flawless standards. Alexander listened without interrupting, but every word Victor said only confirmed what he already knew. This was a man incapable of seeing beyond his own reflection. After the appetizers were served, Victor leaned forward eagerly. "So, Mr. Grant, your team mentioned a potential partnership," he said. "I assume you're interested in expanding our brand." Alexander dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin before answering. "I am interested in expansion," he said slowly. "But before we discuss business, I want to ask you something." Victor smiled, expecting a flattering question about his success. "Of course, anything." Alexander folded his hands on the table. "Tell me, Victor, how do you treat people who can't do anything for you?" The question landed like a stone in a still pond. Victor blinked, thrown off for the first time that evening. "I expect professionalism from everyone," he replied cautiously. "If they can't meet that, they don't belong in my world." Alexander's expression didn't change, but there was a new sharpness in his gaze. "So you believe respect is conditional?" he asked. Victor laughed weakly. "Respect is earned, Mr. Grant. Power isn't for the soft-hearted." Alexander let the words hang in the air for a moment, then reached into his jacket. He placed a printed photo on the table between them, the still image from Victor's viral video. In it, a delivery driver stood beside the Lang Prime table, a pizza box open, a smear of sauce on his jacket. Victor smirked when he saw it. "Ah, yes," he said. "That one did numbers. People love seeing standards enforced." Alexander didn't smile back. "Tell me what you see in this picture," he said quietly. Victor shrugged. "I see a lazy delivery guy who brought me cold food and an attitude." Alexander's eyes hardened. "I see a small business owner being threatened. I see young employees terrified of losing their jobs because one man wanted to feel superior." Victor frowned, irritation rising. "With all due respect, Mr. Grant, I didn't invite you here to discuss some pizza place." Alexander leaned forward, his voice suddenly colder. "You didn't invite me, Victor. I invited you." The shift in tone finally pierced Victor's arrogance. He stared at Alexander, confusion creeping across his face. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Alexander tapped the photo. "You humiliated a delivery driver in front of a room full of people," he said. "You threatened his job, smeared his workplace online, and called it entertainment." Victor rolled his eyes. "Is this some kind of moral lecture? Look, the video helped my brand. People like seeing someone demand excellence." Alexander's jaw tightened slightly. "So you're proud of this," he said, "proud enough to double down on it in front of me." Victor spread his hands. "If you're worried about PR, I can delete the video or issue some generic apology." "No big deal." Alexander's next words sliced through the air. "It is a big deal, Victor, because the man in that video, the one you tried to destroy, was me." For a moment, Victor laughed, assuming it was a joke. "That's a good one," he chuckled. "The billionaire pizza boy, right?" But Alexander didn't laugh. His expression remained deadly serious, and slowly Victor's smile faded. Details started clicking together in his mind. The driver's voice, the posture, the controlled calm even under insult. He looked at the photo again, this time really seeing the face. The resemblance he had dismissed as coincidence now glared back at him like a mirror of his own foolishness. "No," Victor whispered, his throat suddenly dry. That's impossible." Alexander sat back, letting the truth sink in. "I spent an evening in your restaurant wearing a cheap jacket and carrying a pizza box," he said. "And in those few minutes, you told me exactly who you are." Victor's heart pounded in his ears. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. For the first time in a long time, he had no clever comeback. Victor's mind raced as he tried to calculate the damage. If Alexander Grant had truly been that delivery driver, then the viral video was more than a joke. It was a loaded gun pointed at his own reputation. I didn't know," Victor stammered. "If I had known it was you—" Alexander cut him off with a raised hand. "That's exactly the problem," he said. "You only respect people when you think they can help you." Victor swallowed hard. "Look, Mr. Grant, I can fix this," he insisted. "I'll delete the video, issue a statement, offer a donation, whatever you want." Alexander shook his head slowly. "You still don't understand," he replied. "This isn't about a single video. This is about a pattern, years of mistreating staff, suppliers, and anyone you consider beneath you." Victor's eyes widened. "You've been digging into my business?" he asked. Alexander met his gaze evenly. "I've been digging into your character. Unfortunately, there's not much there." Anger flared in Victor's chest, mixing with fear until he could hardly tell them apart. "Who do you think you are, judging me?" he snapped. "You sit in your towers and pretend you're better than everyone else." Alexander didn't flinch. "I've made my share of mistakes," he admitted, "but I don't punish people for doing honest work. I don't threaten to destroy livelihoods for sport." He slid another folder onto the table, this one thicker than the last. "This is a summary of complaints from your former employees, vendors and customers," he said. "Some of them were too afraid to speak up until they knew someone with power was listening." Victor glanced at the folder but didn't open it. "So what now?" he asked bitterly. "You're going to ruin me because I hurt your feelings in a restaurant?" Alexander's gaze turned steely. "No," he said. "I'm going to give you a choice." The word choice caught Victor off guard. His instinct was to assume it meant negotiation, a way out. "What kind of choice?" he asked cautiously. Alexander folded his hands once more, every movement deliberate. "Option 1, he began. "You publicly apologize to Tony's Pizza Shop, to your staff, and to your followers. You admit what you've done, compensate those you've harmed, and step down from day-to-day control of Lang Prime." Victor bristled. "You want me to humiliate myself?" he demanded. Alexander's expression didn't soften. "No," he said, "I want you to finally experience accountability." He continued. "Option 2, I proceed with acquiring your struggling properties, supporting the lawsuits your former employees are preparing, and releasing enough documentation to ensure your name becomes synonymous with abuse of power." The room seemed to tilt as Victor's world narrowed to those two paths, public humility or public destruction. Victor stared at Alexander, his mind ping-ponging between pride and self-preservation. He imagined the headlines, the comments, the investors calling in panic. For years, he had thrived on fear, ensuring no one ever dared to challenge him. Now, the one person he had underestimated had ripped that shield away in a single conversation. "You would really do that?" Victor asked, voice quieter now. "You would go that far?" Alexander held his gaze. "You already did," he replied. "All I'm doing is making sure the consequences finally reach you." Outside, the city lights flickered against the glass, indifferent to the drama unfolding within. Victor lowered his eyes to the untouched dessert in front of him, his appetite gone. The arrogant customer had finally met someone he couldn't bully, charm, or threaten into submission. And as he realized just how late this reckoning had arrived, one truth became painfully clear. Whatever he chose now, the man he had been before this dinner was already gone. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft clink of dishes being cleared at distant tables. Victor's mind raced through numbers, contracts, and escape plans, but every route ended in the same place. Alexander's leverage. "What if I refuse both options?" he asked finally, grasping for one last scrap of control. Alexander tilted his head slightly. "Then the situation leaves this room," he said calmly. "Lawsuits move forward. Employees speak out with my legal and financial backing. Investors learn exactly what kind of man is steering their money." Victor's throat tightened. He had built his identity on the illusion of invincibility. Now that illusion was crumbling. "You're enjoying this," he muttered. Alexander's eyes flickered with something closer to disappointment than satisfaction. "You think this is fun for me?" he replied, watching a man realize how many lives he's shattered. "There's nothing enjoyable about it." Victor slumped back in his chair, the confidence he'd walked in with dissolving into a weary, bitter fatigue. "You don't understand what it's like," he said quietly. "In this business, if you're not feared, you're eaten alive." Alexander considered that for a moment. "Fear is easy," he answered. "Respect is harder, but it lasts longer, and it doesn't require destroying people on your way up." Victor's jaw clenched. "Easy for you to say. You were born with more than I ever had." Alexander shook his head. "You don't know anything about where I started," he replied. "But even if that were true, it doesn't excuse what you've done. Struggle isn't a license to become the monster that once stepped on you." Victor stared at his reflection in the window, wondering when exactly he had crossed the line from survivor to tormentor. The worst part was realizing he couldn't even remember. "Why that night?" Victor asked suddenly. "Why deliver that pizza yourself?" Alexander let out a slow breath. "Because I saw a video," he said. "Not just of you yelling, but of the driver you humiliated. I saw the fear in his eyes, the way he apologized just to make you stop." Victor shifted uncomfortably. "People overreact online," he muttered. "It was just a performance." Alexander leaned forward. "For you," he said. "But for him, it was a memory that doesn't go away. For Tony, it was another night wondering if his shop would survive your tantrum." Victor unfolded the napkin in his lap, his fingers trembling. "So this is payback." Alexander shook his head. "This is a mirror," he replied. "I wanted you to see exactly what you look like from the other side of your power. You just didn't know who was holding it." A server approached the table tentatively. "Is everything all right, gentlemen?" she asked, sensing the tension. Alexander gave a polite nod. "We're fine, thank you, Jenna," he said, reading her name tag. The simple act of addressing her by name was not lost on Victor. He realized with a jolt that he had never once bothered to learn his own staff's names unless it benefited him. As she walked away, Victor rubbed his temples. "If I take your option 1, he said slowly, "what does that actually look like?" Alexander reached for another folder and opened it between them. Inside was a structured plan, a public apology video, restitution payments, mandatory leadership training, and a gradual transition of ownership. "You keep a percentage as a silent partner, enough to live comfortably," Alexander explained. "But you lose the right to treat people like props in your personal show." Victor scanned the papers, his ego recoiling even as his survival instincts recognized the lifeline. "And if I let you destroy me?" Victor asked, voice low. "What then? You get to feel like a hero?" Alexander's gaze hardened. "There are no heroes here," he said. "There are victims who deserve justice, and a system that needs to see what happens when someone like you finally faces consequences." He paused, then added, "But I'd rather see you change than disappear. Not for your sake, for theirs." Victor swallowed the bitter truth. The man across from him didn't need revenge. He had options, resources, and a reputation that would survive with or without this confrontation. Victor, on the other hand, had built everything on a foundation of fear. It was finally sinking in that fear was a terrible thing to stand on when the ground started shaking. "How long do I have to decide?" he asked. Alexander checked his watch. "Until tomorrow morning," he replied. "By then, the lawsuits will be ready either way." That night, Victor sat alone in his lavish penthouse, the city glittering mockingly outside his floor-to-ceiling windows. The usual comfort he derived from the view felt hollow now. His phone buzzed with notifications, likes, comments, new followers praising his savage style, but the glow of the screen only made him feel smaller. He scrolled back through his own videos, watching clip after clip of himself yelling, mocking, humiliating. For the first time, he saw what everyone else had seen for years, not a strong leader, but a bully playing king. He remembered faces, servers who trembled, drivers who apologized, assistants who worked through tears. He realized he didn't know where most of them were now, or how their lives had turned out after crossing his path. For a man who prided himself on being in control, he had left a surprising amount of collateral damage in his wake. His reflection in the dark window looked less like a winner and more like a cautionary tale in the making. On the other side of town, Tony closed his small pizza shop early for the first time in years. His staff sat around a table, still processing the news Alexander had shared with them earlier that day. "So he was really here, in this kitchen?" Mia asked, glancing at the spot where Alexander had once stood folding boxes. Tony nodded. "He said he wanted to see what it was like for us," he replied, "and now he's offering to protect us from people like that guy." The team exchanged looks, a mix of disbelief, relief, and something new. Hope. For so long, they had felt invisible, at the mercy of customers who saw them as disposable. The idea that someone powerful not only noticed, but cared enough to act, felt unreal. "Do you think he'll actually go through with it?" another worker asked. Tony didn't hesitate. "He didn't talk like a man who makes empty promises," he said. "I think our days of being afraid of that restaurant are over." Morning arrived faster than Victor wanted. He hadn't slept much, his mind replaying Alexander's words in an endless loop. At 9 a.m. sharp, his phone rang. The caller ID read, "Rebecca Hale, Grant Legal." He stared at it for a long moment before answering. "This is Victor," he said, his voice hoarse. "Mr. Lang," Rebecca replied, her tone professional but not unkind. "I'm calling to confirm your decision." Victor looked around his penthouse, at the art, the imported furniture, the symbols of success he once believed justified everything. They all felt strangely meaningless now. "I'll take option 1, he said finally. "I'll do the apology. I'll step down. I'll try to fix what I can." On the other end, Rebecca exhaled softly. "I'll send over the documents," she said, "and I'll schedule the recording of your statement. Mr. Grant wants you to understand, this isn't a show. If you're not sincere, people will know." Victor closed his eyes. "Trust me," he replied. "For the first time in my life, I wish this were just a show." The apology video was filmed in a simple, undecorated office. No luxury decor, no dramatic lighting, just Victor and the camera. Alexander watched from a nearby room with Rebecca and Tony, arms folded. They had agreed Victor would speak in his own words, but the truth would be non-negotiable. "My name is Victor Lang," he began, visibly uncomfortable. "For years, I've treated the people who serve me, delivery drivers, servers, staff, as if they were beneath me." He paused, swallowing hard. I told myself it was about standards. In reality, it was about ego and power. Tony's jaw tightened as he watched, remembering every call that had ended with his heart pounding. I publicly humiliated a delivery driver from Tony's Fire Pizza, Victor continued. What I didn't know was that he was also the man who would finally hold me accountable. He glanced briefly at the camera crew, then steadied himself. To Tony, to his staff, to my employees, and to every worker I've disrespected, I am sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I expect to earn it, if that's even possible. When the video went live, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Some viewers rolled their eyes, calling it damage control. Others, especially those who had worked in service jobs, watched it twice, measuring every word and every flicker of emotion. But what made the difference wasn't just the apology, it was what came next. Screenshots of new contracts emerged online, showing back pay being issued to former employees. Tony posted a photo of a signed partnership deal with Grant Hospitality Group, announcing expansions and better benefits for his staff. Former Lang Prime workers shared messages from Alexander's team, offering them positions in new, more respectful workplaces. The narrative shifted. This wasn't just a billionaire punishing an arrogant man. It was a line in the sand about how people who serve are treated. As for Victor, he watched the world react from the sidelines, no longer at the center of the story. The arrogant customer had indeed discovered the truth, but as Alexander had promised, he discovered it far too late to walk away unchanged. Weeks passed, and the internet moved on, as it always did, to fresh scandals and new distractions. But for the people closest to the story, nothing went back to normal. At Tony's Fire Pizza, the atmosphere felt lighter than it had in years. The staff now had health insurance, higher wages, and a posted policy that no one would ever be punished for refusing abuse. Customers who had seen the apology video came in specifically to support the shop, leaving generous tips and kind words. Mia, once terrified of difficult orders, now trained new hires with confidence. A framed photo hung near the register. Tony, his team, and Alexander standing together, no suits, no disguises, just equal smiles. Most customers never noticed the billionaire in the picture. They just saw a man who respected the people beside him. And that, Alexander thought, was exactly as it should be. For Victor, life became quieter and strangely louder at the same time. The constant stream of praise, flattery, and online validation dried up overnight. Brands cut ties. Investors pulled out, citing reputational concerns. His phone, once a relentless source of ego fuel, now mostly delivered silence. But in that empty space, other sounds emerged. His own thoughts, memories he had tried to ignore, and the echo of his own voice shouting in old videos. He started watching those clips not as content, but as evidence. Each time he saw a server flinch or a driver swallow an insult, it felt like a punch to the gut. He realized he had spent years performing cruelty for an audience he would never truly know. For the first time, he wondered what it would feel like to be respected without fear, and whether he was capable of earning that kind of respect at all. Alexander kept his distance at first, honoring the boundary they had agreed upon. Victor had his own work to do, and no amount of money or pressure could force genuine change. But one afternoon, months later, Victor requested a meeting, not at a rooftop restaurant or a luxury venue, but at a small community center. When Alexander arrived, he found Victor sitting on a folding chair in a plain room, dark circles under his eyes and no cameras in sight. "I've been volunteering here," Victor said, before Alexander could ask. "They run job training and food drives. They didn't want my money at first. They wanted my time." Alexander looked around the room, noting the donated clothes racks, the bulletin board full of handwritten notes, the quiet hum of people helping people. "And did you give it?" he asked. Victor nodded slowly. "I'm trying," he said. "It's different when no one is watching." They sat side by side, not as enemy and judge, but as two men who knew how easy it was to lose yourself in your own reflection. Victor spoke haltingly about the therapy he'd started, the former employees he'd met with privately, to listen rather than defend himself. Some had accepted his attempts at restitution. Others had told him, bluntly, that it was too late. "I don't blame them," Victor admitted. "There are things you can't undo." Alexander listened without offering easy absolution. "You can't rewrite the past," he agreed, "but you can decide what you do with whatever time and influence you have left." Victor gave a short, humorless laugh. "Influence," he said. "I used to think influence meant owning the room. Now I'm learning it might just mean not ruining it for everyone else." For the first time, Alexander saw something in Victor that he hadn't seen at that restaurant table, humility that didn't feel like a performance. Alexander's own life shifted too. The pizza billionaire story became a cautionary tale taught in business schools and leadership seminars. Consultants tried to turn it into a slide deck formula, but the core remained stubbornly simple. How you treat the people serving you reveals who you really are. Alexander began speaking more openly about his undercover experiences, not just as a delivery driver, but in other roles he had quietly tried over the years: janitor, call center agent, warehouse worker. Each disguise had given him a fuller picture of the world his own success often insulated him from. He launched a program that paid executives to spend mandatory time in frontline roles, not as guests, but as actual workers. Some embraced it. Others quit rather than give up their illusion of importance. That too told Alexander everything he needed to know. Tony's Fire Pizza expanded to 3 locations, each one retaining the original shop's warmth and humility. The new branches proudly displayed a simple motto on the wall: "Everyone deserves respect, no exceptions." Delivery drivers were given better routes, safer procedures, and the authority to walk away from abusive customers without penalty. When a customer complained loudly one night and threatened to ruin the shop online, a manager calmly replied, "You're welcome to share your experience. So are we." Word spread that Tony's wasn't just good at pizza, it was good at protecting its people. Applications poured in from workers tired of being treated like disposable parts. Tony, once perpetually tired and anxious, found himself smiling more, sleeping better, and believing in the future of his business in a way he hadn't in years. One evening, Mia delivered an order to a small apartment on the edge of town. When the door opened, she froze for just a second. Victor stood there, wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, no cameras, no entourage. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then Victor cleared his throat. "Hi," he said. "I, ordered the large veggie with extra olives." Mia nodded, handing over the box. There was an awkward pause as he fumbled with his wallet. "Listen," he said, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "I used to be someone who made your job harder. I'm trying not to be that person anymore." He handed her a generous tip, cash folded neatly around the receipt. "Thank you for what you do," he added, the words unfamiliar but sincere. Mia walked back to her car in stunned silence, then smiled slowly. People talked about the power of billionaires all the time, she thought. But maybe the real power was in something as simple as learning to say thank you and mean it. The viral clip that had once defined Victor's image didn't disappear, but it was eventually buried under new content, some his, most not. What remained, in the long run, wasn't the moment he sneered at a delivery driver, but the way he chose to respond once the mask was ripped away. He began using his remaining platform to highlight small businesses and service workers, often anonymously at first. He refused sponsorship deals that required him to perform cruelty for clicks. Some people called it redemption, others called it rebranding. Alexander didn't bother arguing with either side. He knew the truth was more complicated than a headline could capture. People rarely transform in clean, cinematic arcs. They stumble, resist, relapse, try again. The important part was that the fear in those workers' eyes had been replaced, at least in some places, with something closer to security. Years later, a young entrepreneur nervously pitched a new restaurant concept to Alexander. The idea was simple: a place where the staff's names were on the wall alongside the menu, where customer reviews rated kindness as highly as flavor. "I know it sounds cheesy," the entrepreneur said, "but I want people to leave feeling like they mattered, not just like they spent money." Alexander listened, the corners of his mouth lifting. "It doesn't sound cheesy at all," he replied. "It sounds overdue." As they shook hands on the investment, Alexander's mind flashed back to that rainy night. The weight of the delivery bag, the sting of sauce on his sleeve, Victor's words like venom in the air. So much had changed since then. And yet the lesson remained the same. Titles, suits, and bank accounts could all vanish. The way you treated the person at your door, however, echoed far beyond the moment. On the anniversary of the infamous delivery, Alexander returned to the original Tony's Fire Pizza, now busier than ever. He sat at a corner table. No disguise this time, just a man enjoying a slice. Tony joined him, wiping his hands on his apron. "Funny, isn't it?" Tony said. "All this started with one bad customer." Alexander shook his head. "No," he replied. "It started with people who deserved better finally being seen." Outside, a delivery driver hopped on a scooter and disappeared into the city night, carrying someone's dinner and, unknowingly, a piece of a story that had changed more than just one arrogant man. Alexander watched him go, feeling quietly grateful for the night he'd chosen to step out of his tower and into a cheap delivery jacket. The billionaire disguise had come off long ago, but the lesson it revealed stayed with everyone who heard it. You never really know who's standing in front of you, or how late it might be when you realize what your actions truly cost. As word of Alexander's undercover experiment spread through business circles, reactions were mixed. Some executives privately mocked the idea of a billionaire playing dress-up as a delivery driver. Others felt an uncomfortable twinge, remembering times they had barked at staff or snapped at couriers. Alexander wasn't interested in winning popularity contests, he was interested in starting conversations. At conferences, he didn't brag about profit margins or market share. Instead, he told the story of standing in a restaurant as a nobody, watching a man weaponize status over something as simple as a pizza. Every time he spoke, at least one person in the audience shifted in their seat, thinking of someone they needed to call and apologize to. Change, Alexander knew, rarely began with applause. It began with discomfort. One evening, Alexander hosted a small round table at a modest hotel conference room. No cameras, no fanfare. The guests were a mix of CEOs, managers, and frontline workers from different industries. He opened the discussion not with a speech, but with a question. When was the last time someone made you feel small? The room fell quiet as people shared stories, some recent, some decades old. A hotel housekeeper spoke about guests who treated her like furniture. A former fast food worker remembered being mocked for her accent. A junior manager admitted he used to talk tough to feel important, only to realize he sounded exactly like the bosses he'd hated. Alexander shared his own experience of being fired from Tony's despite being a billionaire, and how much that truth had stung. By the end of the night, the title on his name tag mattered less than the stories they had all laid on the table. Meanwhile, Tony's Fire Pizza became a quiet symbol of what could happen when power shifted in the right direction. Local schools invited Tony and his staff to speak about workplace respect and standing up to bullying. Mia, once the shy delivery girl, stood in front of classrooms telling students, "Your worth is not defined by someone else's bad mood." She talked about the billionaire who had chosen to stand in her shoes instead of staying safe in a boardroom. Kids listened, some thinking about their own parents working long hours in service jobs. A few even went home and hugged them a little tighter that night. Tony never saw himself as a hero. He just saw himself as a man who kept showing up, even when people like Victor tried to crush him. But to countless young people, his story, and Alexander's, quietly rewrote what strength looked like. Victor's journey remained complicated, as most real transformations are. Some days, he caught himself slipping into old habits, a sharp tone here, an impatient look there. The difference now was that he noticed. He apologized when he snapped. He listened when someone said that wasn't okay. He attended workshops where he was no longer the most powerful person in the room, learning to sit with the discomfort of being challenged. There were plenty who refused to forgive him, and he stopped trying to force them. Instead, he focused on the people directly in front of him, the volunteers at the community center, the staff at stores he visited, the drivers who brought packages to his building. Every thank you he offered wasn't penance. It was practice. Practice at being the kind of man he wished someone had been for him when he was younger. One rainy afternoon, much like the night of the infamous delivery, Alexander walked through the city without an entourage. He stopped at a crowded intersection and watched the choreography of urban life unfold. Couriers balancing bags on one hand while checking maps with the other. Ride-share drivers idling at the curb. Restaurant workers hauling trash out back, unnoticed by the people walking past. For a moment, he felt the old urge to disappear into their world again, to don another uniform and listen quietly from the edges. But then he realized something important. He didn't need a disguise anymore to remember what he'd learned. The lesson had already seeped into the way he moved through the world. How he made eye contact, how he said hello, how he considered the stories behind every name tag. That night, Alexander hosted a small dinner, not for investors or politicians, but for workers from all levels of his own company. Warehouse staff sat beside senior managers. Receptionists ate next to division heads. Name tags listed first names only, no titles, no departments. For the first hour, conversation was awkward, as people tried to guess who held which role. Then the stories began to flow. Funny delivery mishaps, difficult customers, moments of unexpected kindness. At the end of the meal, Alexander stood and revealed something that made the room go silent. "Every person in this room," he said, "will receive a raise and new protections against customer abuse. No job here is low level. There are only different responsibilities, all of them necessary." The applause wasn't thunderous, but it was steady and real. For many present, it was the first time someone at the top had explicitly said, "You matter," and then backed it up with action. The story of the billionaire pizza driver took on a life of its own. Some retellings exaggerated details, others softened them, but the core always remained. A powerful man put himself beneath his own customers and didn't like what he saw. Teachers turned the story into classroom discussions about empathy. Parents told it to their kids before their first jobs, reminding them both to work hard and to demand respect. Even a few influencers, ironically, the same crowd that had once cheered Victor's cruelty, started making content about treating service workers better. Trends would come and go, but this one left a trace that stuck around. Videos of customers standing up for drivers, tipping extra, or simply saying, "I know your job is hard. Thank you." The internet, for once, amplified something worth repeating. Years later, a young man walked into Tony's Fire Pizza and asked if they were hiring. He wore a threadbare hoodie and carried a worn-out backpack, eyes guarded but hopeful. Mia, now assistant manager, handed him an application and a pen. "Have you ever delivered before?" she asked. He shook his head. "No," he admitted. "But my mom used to. She got yelled at a lot. I want to show her it doesn't have to be like that." Mia smiled. recognizing in him the same quiet determination she'd once seen in herself. "You're in the right place," she said. When he stepped into the kitchen for his first shift, he didn't know that the policies protecting him, the pay he'd receive, and the respect he'd be shown all traced back to a billionaire who once wore the same jacket. He just knew that when he walked through the door that night, he felt like more than a body filling a schedule slot. One final conversation between Alexander and Victor happened years after their first confrontation, on a park bench overlooking the city. They sat in a comfortable silence at first, watching joggers pass and children play. "Do you ever regret doing it?" Victor asked finally. "The delivery, the video, all of it." Alexander thought about the question for a long moment. "I regret that it had to be you," he said honestly. "I wish you'd never become the man I met that night. But I don't regret the truth coming out." Victor nodded slowly. "I used to think my worst day was when you walked into my life," he said. "Now I'm starting to think it might have been my best." Alexander didn't respond with a grand statement. He just nodded once, accepting the complexity of it. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, casting long shadows across the park, Alexander stood to leave. He adjusted his coat, then glanced down at the pizza box resting on the bench between them, 2 slices left from a small shop not far away. "You can keep the leftovers," he said with a faint smile. "Try not to yell at the delivery guy next time." Victor snorted softly, shaking his head. "I'll try something radical," he replied. "I'll thank him." Alexander walked away, blending into the crowd like any other man heading home after a long day. No cameras followed, no headlines screamed his name. Somewhere, a doorbell rang, and a delivery driver lifted a box, bracing out of habit for whatever waited on the other side. Maybe this time it was kindness. Maybe it wasn't. But thanks to one rainy night and one arrogant customer who discovered the truth too late, a few more people in the world had started to understand a simple, powerful truth. Titles fade, fortunes shift, but the way you treat the person at your door is the part of you that never really disappears.